Welcome to a brief overview of the geopolitics of ancient China. The geography of ancient China played an essential role in shaping its political formations, its civilization as a whole, and its long lasting culture and its gigantic economy throughout the centuries. China was one of the first places where civilization formed, starting out on the North China Plain. The primary location, centered around the Yellow River, is called the Yellow River in English due to the yellow U from the silt. The silt was very rich in minerals, which was great for farming wheat, and still is, along with millet, buckwheat, and most of all rice. This would lead to the cradle of Chinese civilization, the Shang and later Zhao dynasties. Sorry for the mispronunciation. Wheat was quite popular along the northern portions of what would become the birthplace of Chinese civilization, as wheat is excellent in colder climates with rich soil and flat land. The river provided water, which could support large populations similar to those of Mesopotamia and Egypt, which formed a bit before China. However, the river was prone to flooding, and still is, earning the Yellow River the nickname China's Sorrow. According to mythology and legend, Yu the engineer, one of the first great kings, if you could call him that, whether or not he existed, we don't really know, would set the foundations of infrastructure projects needed to prevent excess flooding, while at the same time allowing for irrigation. The Yellow River's unpredictability has parallels to those of the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia, rather than the more benign Nile River in Egypt. This may explain why Chinese civilization values harmony, but also has a great degree of fear and authority. This legendary king was probably the result of various chiefdoms who supported infrastructure projects before written records, or at least before those records were written on anything other than turtle shells. These stories, both true and exaggerated, probably combined into one: Yu the engineer. The first great Chinese cultural hero was not a general or some sort of god king, but rather a man who shares the same profession as Dilbert. The other major river is the Yangtze River, which has a large river basin. It's located south of the Yellow River. This river is longer and more stable than the Yellow River, and it's arguably the third or fourth longest river in the world after the Nile, Amazon, and arguably Mississippi. On top of that, it's mostly navigable and helped spread civilization into the interior. This area supports rice agriculture, which led to massive population growth. Rice can be farmed on low lying fields next to the river, but also on hillsides through the use of terraces. Rice farming is very labor intensive, though, and requires a great deal of organization. This may partially explain China's work ethic and rigid, efficient bureaucracy, as well as perhaps its liking to authoritarianism. This would become the center point of Han and Tang dynasties. To the south of this river basin lies southern hills and river valleys with lush subtropical climates. This area, by and large, was less centralized, and by and large was harder for government authorities to wrest control over. The rough terrain led to this region later being integrated through agricultural expansion and trade, along with a good degree of stabbing people with spears and swords. The jungles further south acted as a buffer between China and Southeast Asia. Loose influence would cross these jungles and the nearby coast, but Southeast Asia, including what is now Vietnam, would maintain its distinct identity, using the hilly jungles as a way to resist Chinese expansion. Further west lies the Himalayas. This provides natural protection from invasion, and it also is home to gigantic glaciers, which feed the rivers of China and the Indian subcontinent, providing them with plenty of minerals needed to produce large yields of crops. This is why China and India have such large populations. Despite being relatively close to each other, Chinese and Indian civilizations barely made contact with each other, both in times of peace and war, as these mountain peaks created a geographic barrier. After all, the Himalayas are relatively recent and young in geographic terms, happening when the Eurasian plate hit the Indian plate. Generally speaking, the tallest mountain ranges, of which the Himalayas are the tallest of the tall, tend to be younger as there's been less time to erode them down. As a result of this barrier, the Indian subcontinent had more contact with the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and even Europe than it did with China. This meant that outside contact had to go through a narrow passage from China to the rest of the world, north of the Tibetan Plateau, but south of the desert. This would later be known as the Silk Road. To the north of this passage was the Taklamakan Desert, which by and large is sparsely inhabited to this day and filled with Turkic Uyghur speaking peoples today. By and large, this was dominated by steppe cultures, not Han Chinese, at least during this time. To the northeast is the Gobi Desert in what is now Mongolia. This area is very hot and arid, terrible for farming and only suitable for the hardiest nomads. However, keep in mind that during the winter, it's also really, really cold, which makes habitation even tougher. Many of these nomadic people saw the Chinese living in a far better climate as rather soft due to their easier environmental conditions and civilization. Throughout most of Chinese history, Han Chinese people had very little control over this area, and the terrible environment discouraged migration or invasion. Well, at least from south to north. The same was not true for north to south. It turned out the Mongols, Manchurians, and other people groups to the north were rather fond of passing through these mountains and deserts to reach China for conquest, and China would be the first target of Mongolian wrath. The famous Great Wall was built to prevent invasion, but by and large failed, as the loose border was far too long. Keep in mind that the Great Wall does not sit on the current Chinese-Mongolian border, but rather is a little bit north of Beijing. This is because there are a lot of ethnic Mongolians that still live to the north of the wall, and more ethnic Mongolians live in what is now China proper than what is Mongolia proper. After all, Inner Mongolia is more habitable than Mongolia. But at the time, neither of these existed. They were just kind of loose areas tied to a specific people group, a specific culture, language, etc. The Chinese did not bother moving far north due to the arid climate, scorching summers, and frigid winters. They didn't really bother with Siberia. The Mongols would be able to conquer China, but eventually Chinese civilization conquered the Mongols. Many of these nomads would eventually settle down and adapt to civilization, adopt a more refined culture. To the east of China is the Pacific Ocean, which provided isolation from seafaring invasions, at least for now. Later on, this became a maritime route for, well, maritime traders during the Tang and Song dynasties during the Middle Ages. However, China never became a major maritime power beyond its continental shelf and a few discontinued voyages long after the ancient era. However, that may change during this decade or the next.